Okay, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming to this event. We have the career centers. We have Savik and Courtney that are here to facilitate this event, kind of give some information about resume building, CVs, and interview process. But before we get started, I'm going to pass the speech over to Erin for some announcements about upcoming MAPS events and other things.
Yes, thank you, Tina K. Um, so a few quick announcements for upcoming events. Next Thursday, March 18th, we are hosting our speed mentoring event. It is one of our more popular events when we were in person, where we invite a whole bunch of graduate students from a whole bunch of different colleges here on campus. And then it's kind of set up like speed dating. So you get to speak to a graduate student and then you move on to your second one and you keep on going. The goal is to talk to as many graduate students as you can and ask them questions about taking the MCAT or the PCAT or study tips, how to build a resume or like what they did to build up their resume. So asking questions uh, for these grad students in kind of like a speed dating kind of fashion. So it's going to be super fun. So if you haven't already RSVP to this event, that will be again on Thursday next week, March 18th. Then also another upcoming event that is super popular for MAPS is our Suture Lab. Dr. Martinez, you guys probably seen her already. She is our advisor and she will be leading that session. Where she will teach you how to suture, and then we will be giving out suture kits. It will be what's it say? Those who paid dues and those who've signed up on our sign up list will be able to get a kit. I do have a kit right here since I already picked them up from the office. But what you get is you get all the tools you need for suturing. You get a little silicone pad and then like a whole bunch of sutures. So you get to learn how to suture from Dr. Martinez. But first you have to make sure that you paid your dues and that you've signed up on our list that we send out through our email. I can also send out a link in the chat right now as well. And that's all I have for announcements, Tina K.
Okay, well then I guess it's passed on to Savik and Courtney.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for having us come attend this virtually. I know last year we did this in person and it was way more fun because we had a bag of candy that we were able to throw out at all of you as you answered and interacted with us. So you kind of have to play along with us this time. But as Courtney pulls up the slides, we'll do a quick introduction of ourselves. So again, my name is Savik Iswami. I work as a career advisor for the Pomerantz Career Center and specifically within the health and wellness career community. So if you all are thinking about life after Iowa and it involves something to do with healthcare or health sciences, you can always schedule an appointment with me. On the fun side, I also went to the University of Iowa, so if you want to connect about anything along those lines, certainly let me know. But that's me.
And my name is Courtney. I, like Savik, I'm a health and wellness advisor in the Career Center. What Savik did not mention is that his wife is also a doctor, so he has some insider tips on that too. But we're excited to be here chatting with you guys. We tried to keep this pretty short and sweet on the presentation front, hoping that you all had some questions. I know we try to anticipate what you're thinking about, but of course want to hear it from you guys. So please feel free to jump in or send something in the chat. We'll try to keep an eye on it as we go.
Yeah, and we just really want to reiterate that, Courtney and I mean, we could talk about this stuff for an hour straight, but there's just no chance anyone wants to do that. So, definitely interact with us, unmute yourself. I've got the chat window pulled up here as well. So whatever you feel comfortable, just let us know. And really tonight is meant for all of you. It's meant to be a resource and a conversation. So just let us know. So with that, let's begin. Courtney.
Let's roll. All right. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to start with was like kind of the resume and CV piece of grad school prep or job prep. So I wanted to start off with some formatting. And the reason that formatting is so important is because you guys have probably heard this, and it might be a little bit different like in medicine versus maybe like in business or something, but people look at your resume and they make an they get an impression from you based on how your resume actually looks, even before they read anything on there and, go through the content. So having some good formatting first and foremost is step one in terms of getting your resume set up. So a few things to be thinking about in terms of guidelines on that. Usually we say a resume is 1 page long. Now, if you guys are looking to graduate school, very, very common for it to be on the second page. So being a little bit longer than 1 page is totally okay in that instance. And we do have another slide about some extra things that might be on a grad school resume that might make it longer. So we'll get there in a minute. Other things to be thinking about, 10 to 12 point font is pretty standard for your resume. Obviously, choose a pretty standard font as well, not anything too bubbly or huge or weird. You can make the judgment call on that. We say 1/2 inch to 1 inch margins, again, pretty standard there. One of the big things that we like to remind students of is to leave white space on your resume. Sometimes students try to, cram things too close together, and then all of a sudden you have just a big page of black ink, right? You want to make sure that you leave some white space on there just to kind of break up your experiences a little bit. And again, add to that visual appeal, which is a big deal. Obviously, proofreading and spell checking. Your resume is a representation of you, and you want to come off as being really detail oriented and professional. So make sure that you proofread and spell check. In terms of templates, you guys might have found these before. I know I know Word has some, I think, when you type in like resume, and you'll probably find some cute ones on Google. We say to avoid using them. They're cuter than a bug in a rug most of the time, with some cool, patterns and colors and things like that. But oftentimes they don't move very much, right? So you can't change the order of your sections or the formatting that they have set up. You can't change your margins or shift section orders and things like that. So we say they're actually a little bit more challenging. Sometimes they don't use your resume real estate as much as we would like you to use. So we say start from scratch. Word document is probably our best recommendation there. And then in terms of submitting your resume, we recommend to submit as a PDF file. You all have probably heard this before. Word can change formatting in different versions, or if you use an online, what's that one on Google? Google Docs.
Google Docs.
Things like, yeah. If you use that, things can change across computers. So PDF is going to hold your formatting, and that's probably the safest way to submit for jobs or grad school applications. Questions on formatting? And the sample on the slide here is just kind of an example. I mean, you can see the white space going on there. It's pretty consistent. You can see their headers. Their different sections are nicely laid out. Dates are pretty consistent on there. So just kind of a sample there. Okay.
So what we thought we could do is kind of break down each section in a little bit more detail. And really, if you think about starting from the top, that's going to be your header. And the way that I kind of like to visualize this, because I'm a visualized learner, is think about a menu at your favorite restaurant. Like, you are immediately going to be more hungry when the menu is laid out really, really well. And typically at the top of your menu is going to say Chipotle, because that's the best restaurant. Let's be honest. So it says Chipotle going across. So in this case, it's going to be your contact information. So these are just some examples of how you can lay out your header. Typically with your header, what you're going to want to do is, at the simplest levels, your first and last name, your phone number, email address, and then your mailing address. We put a couple asterisks on that because we kind of advise towards using a current address as well as a permanent address. So for example, when I was a student on campus, my current address was the apartment that I lived in. But with that apartment, I'm kind of bouncing around from place to place. My permanent address was my parents' house. So that's what we like to include some of those information in there, just so you know how to get in contact with you. But really, the most important thing is just going to be using a phone number and using an email address that you check frequently. Mm-hmm. The other thing that you can include on your header as well is going to be a LinkedIn URL or a website for portfolios. Courtney and I were actually working with a student, I think it was 2 years ago, last year, I can't remember exactly when, but she was an art major and she wanted to showcase her art skills. And so we decided, hey, if you want to showcase them, because that's a big part of who you are, go ahead and throw on your website portfolio link on there too. But when you're thinking about just ways to get started, I think having a really, really clean header is the place to go and the place to begin this. As you can see from the examples that you have here on the screen, the largest and the most bold font on these headers, that's going to be your first and last name, because again, that's probably going to be the most important thing, to be able to say, hey, this is the resume for Savik Goswami. But this is how you get this whole thing started. A nice clean header.
All right.
That's that.
Cool. Okay. So the next thing that you'll probably have on your resume that we recommend, you guys are all in college right now. So we recommend that the first thing after your header, obviously, is to have your education section listed out. The reason we recommend that is because that's a big commitment, right? To be in college for a few years. That's probably your biggest commitment, unless you're working full time as well. Most students aren't, some are certainly. But it's also going to show your credentials that you're working toward, right? That bachelor's degree that you're working on, maybe some certificates, minors, things like that. So we recommend having that as the top section on your resume. A few points about your education section. You only want to list institutions where you received a degree. So obviously you'll have Iowa on there, even though you haven't received your degree, it's not in hand, you're anticipating getting a degree from Iowa and you're working toward it. So that's for sure going to be in your education section. If you receive like an AA or an AS degree, some sort of, community college degree, you would list that as well. If you just got credit, if you took 10 credits from Kirkwood Community College, irrelevant to list. You do not need to list Kirkwood, DMACC, any other community college on there if you just took a few credits there. It's only if you got a degree. High school is a question that we get sometimes. By the time you guys are applying to graduate school, I would say probably not. You don't need it. It's clear if you got into college that you graduated from high school in some way. So it's probably not adding much to do it. The only reason that we usually tell students to leave high school on is if they need to fill space on their resume, which, knowing that you all are interested in healthcare, I know you're doing a million other things to fill your resume, so high school probably isn't needed. Other things to be thinking about, a common mistake that we see is that students list their major and not their degree. So instead of saying major communication studies, like in this sample on here, we want to say what degree, like what bachelor's degree you're getting. So in this case, it's a BA. For you guys, it might be a BS in biology or whatever you're working towards. So list the degree. Also a great place to put any minors and certificates, definitely list those in your education section. GPA we recommend to include. We have the cutoff of a 3.0 is kind of what we recommend in terms of, do I put it on, do I not put it on? It's not to say that your GPA is horrible if it's under a 3.0, that's not the case. We just wouldn't want it to, harm you in any way if someone else had an expectation for what your GPA should be. So we say 3.0 is a good cutoff. Obviously you can include honors accomplishments on here. If you studied abroad, you can list out that's kind of the asterisk. Even though you don't get a degree from studying abroad, that's kind of a unique educational experience that you could list under education section. And then the unique thing, this is the only place on your resume probably that you'll have this, is how you list your date. For your education, you don't put the range since you started at Iowa until where you are now. You're going to put your anticipated graduation month and year. So you can see on here, it's the anticipated May of the year. That was fast, is a lot. Questions on education? And if you think of them later, obviously we can come back to it, just trying to get through it for you guys. All right, cool.
All right, so then the next kind of thing you want to be thinking about after you knock out the education section is to then go through the resume sections. And there's a lot of different sections that you can include. My big recommendation as you think about what experience do I include on my resume is to always be thinking about what is the most relevant thing you have on your resume, and then what is the most recent thing you have on your resume. And if you think about all of your activities that you've done so far, you can then categorize them into some of the sections that you see up here on these bullets. So those things could be employment experiences, leadership experiences, so on and so forth. The one that I do want to kind of dive into a little bit more detail is going to be that skills bullet point. I see this a lot on resumes that come through. When we mean skills, we're talking about technical skills that you have versus soft skills. So a soft skill would be things like customer service, leadership, teamwork, all great things that you need to be a healthcare practitioner. But those are all words that we can incorporate into your bullet points. When we mean those technical skills, those are going to be things that you can show in a sense through an act. So that's one thing that I see a lot on resumes, is a section at the very bottom that has a list of soft skills. Let's instead use those as bullet points in each of these sections. This picture that you see on the screen, that's just a sample layout. Again, as Courtney mentioned, education is always going to be at the top of your resume. But then as you kind of think about all of your activities, you can pick and choose where you want to lay things out. But again, always be thinking about what is the most relevant experience you have, what's the most recent experience you have, and then you can kind of put some of these things all together and start creating your format. If you're kind of sitting there right now and you think to yourself, like, I don't really know even where to begin with some of these sections, I would say to start with a rough draft. And literally on that rough draft, all I want you to do is write out everything that you're involved in, every class that you've taken at the university or outside of the university that you think is really relevant to your healthcare experiences, and just start to take a look to see if you can see any themes that start to emerge. When I was a student on campus, I was super involved in student organizations. So my leadership section was like one of my largest sections because I was really proud of that when I was applying for positions as well as graduate school as well. So just be thinking about that. What kinds of experiences do you want to showcase? Do you want to be a part of your brand as you take a look at graduate school or employment? We left this little one at the very bottom as a blank because next slide, Courtney's going to talk to you about some other sections that you can consider.
Absolutely. So some sections here are what you might see more on like a graduate school resume. So, and again, not everyone is going to have every type of section, and there's so much variety in what you can do. You can put blank experience with anything, right? You could have healthcare experience. For me, when I applied to graduate school, I had student affairs experience, right? Like you can make whatever category you want. So all of those that were listed on the last slide are good places to start. But these are ones that might be a little bit more relevant for graduate school, or that might be more included on an academic type resume versus if you were applying to your first job, for example. So things like research experience, if any of you are involved in lab work, that would be super relevant to, after college studies that you're, planning on. So definitely want to include a section on that. Professional associations, if you're involved with any publications and presentations. So if you've, helped in that lab, or if you've worked with a faculty member on doing some writing or doing some presentations at different conferences, that's worthwhile to put on here. Educational travel, professional development would be like conferences that you've attended or different trainings that you've gone through. So you can kind of see how, going back to this last slide, this one might be a little bit more of a, not necessarily, but maybe a little bit more of like a work heavy slide. And this one is going to bring in some more of those academic things that are probably more relevant for grad school type stuff, if that makes sense. And again, everyone's is going to look really different. I didn't have any of these on my resume when I applied to graduate school, so it's going to look different. I wasn't in research. I was not a doctor. But everyone's, like I said, is going to be really different, and you just have to evaluate, again, like Savik said, what's the most relevant to pump up toward the top that makes sense with what your goal is in terms of using the resume.
Now, really, when you think about all these different section headers, doesn't mean a whole lot unless you can fill those sections with some really relevant and really, really good content. So I truly believe that experience is going to be the most important thing that's on your resume. So really, when you think about how do you kind of lay things out, I really like this as an example. I'm a big fan of having the title or whatever member kind of be that first line. That second line would then be your organization. So in this example, it's front desk assistant, job title. The next line, Pomerantz Career Center, University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa. And then bumped all the way out to the right to be aligned with the rest of your dates, the date of when you started that position, and if it's still going on, go ahead and throw that on there as well. And then you go think about your content. So when you think about content, Courtney and I always advise having anywhere between 3 to 5 bullet points per experience. And then with those bullet points, be thinking about how can you tailor this information to fit the situation that you're looking at. And we've got here on this next slide a couple of examples that you could take a look at of different ways to kind of build this out.
Absolutely. And the point we're really trying to make here is that even if you're not talking about a work experience or something, there's a million ways to still talk about the experiences you've gained in other areas, right? So like the example with this, the varsity women's swimming and diving team, instead of just saying flopped around in the pool, they're talking about the skills that they got from being on the swimming and diving team. So motivating, planning, and implementing. So it's really talking about those skills that you're gaining across all of these different experiences, and every experience you have has skills. You just have to reflect on it a little bit more deeply. But this is how you're going to fill in the gaps as you're picking out those sections that we talked about previously. You're going to be filling them in with all these different types of experiences and making sure that you're including really strong bullet points to showcase to someone what you gained along the way.
Yeah, and this next slide is kind of what I was mentioning earlier in terms of like, where do you start? So this is just to kind of give you an idea of some section headers and then things that you can kind of throw into each of those section headers. And so, we'll just kind of use the volunteering experience. You could create that section header that says volunteer experience. And then you would have one like any hospitals and clinics that you've been a part of, any community organizations that you've done, nursing homes, schools. And you can think about volunteer position. What did you take away? Those 3 to 5 bullet points are going to be really relevant to what you're using this resume for, and kind of move on from there. We'll talk about like how to write a really effective bullet point, because again, when you think about section headers, that's great and all. We really need to make sure your content is strong and is going to hold up against other applicants, but also really portray you in a really nice light. So let's chat about bullet points.
We all love bullet points. Yes. So the general gist of the bullet point that we're always talking about is this little formula that you'll see at the bottom of the screen here. So we always recommend to start out your bullet point with a strong verb. And we always recommend to do it in past tense, even if you're currently doing that experience. We say to do it in past tense because you don't have to go back and remember to change the tense of your verbs once you're done with that. It just makes it a little bit easier, more consistent to have all the verbs across your resume in past tense. So you start with that strong past tense verb. Again, you're not starting with like, I did something, straight up past tense verb. Then you say what you did and then why or how you did it. Biggest issue that I see with bullet points, kind of like I talked to you guys about before with my swimming example, was too often students will put the task that they did, but they're not talking about the skill that they gained, right? So my swimming example, if I said swam laps, that's a great skill. I mean, I'm not a great swimmer, so I guess there's a skill associated with that. But the bigger picture that I want to take away from that is the motivation of teammates and the planning and organizing, like was talked about in those other bullet points. So again, thinking a little bit bigger picture with your bullets is the key here. You definitely want to be targeted and transferable. Those soft skills that Savik mentioned, those are the same thing as transferable skills. They're the skills that are going to transfer from one experience to the next, hence the name transferable. Communication, problem solving, teamwork, leadership, all of those kind of big picture ones are what we're talking about there. In terms of how long these can be, I've had students ask me, do I need to stay on just one line with my bullet points? They can go on to a second line, that's no problem, but you don't want it to be a paragraph, right? So reasonable in length, but make sure you're getting your answer out. We do recommend to quantify whenever possible. So if there's numbers to include, if you increase something by a certain percentage, or if you tutored 15 students or whatever it is, putting some numbers in there is helpful. Answer those questions, who, what, when, where, or why. And then always be honest. We work with students on writing really strong bullet points and making the language a little bit more complex, but we never want to actually get rid of what you did. You know what I mean? We might make it sound really nice and maybe sound fancier than students think about it in their head. But it's not a lie. It's still true to what they did. So this is kind of the formula for some bullet points here.
And I don't know if anyone watches the show Friends at all, or maybe have seen this episode, but it's in the classic episode where Joey applies for a position. And in one of his bullet points, he said that he could speak French, and then he had to speak in French and just couldn't do it. But classic episode, again, you just want to make sure you be honest so you don't find yourself in that similar situation. Anyways, let's talk about example bullet points. This is probably one of my favorite slides in this entire presentation. So if I were all of you, I would either take a screenshot of this or take a picture with your phone, because this is the exact same thing that Courtney was mentioning in that previous slide. Taking and looking at what you have in terms of your bullet points and finding other ways to showcase the skills, and then kind of what you were able to kind of take away from it in a sense. So these are just some examples. And, you know, I see the answered questions for customers if they needed help a lot, because I think a lot of the positions that you may have are customer service oriented positions. I know they definitely were for me. I worked at a grocery store, I worked at a restaurant. Everything that I did was customer service. And there's a lot of cool ways that you can showcase those skills and kind of, you know, make those transferable, especially to the healthcare industry. So again, you can kind of take a look at some of these with that box strategy of writing out and kind of completing the thoughts on your bullet points. So I want to make sure that we kind of switch over to interviewing. But I think our next slide is just kind of some like tips and tricks. But we can kind of definitely pause there for other questions about bullet points and just resumes in general too. Oh yeah, so great, we got a question here. Are these full sentences? I notice there's no period at the end of each bullet. Yeah, so these are technically, we just say to not put any periods on them since you're not fully writing these sentences out. And so that's something that you'll see on these resumes is no periods at the end of each bullet point. and then starting each with a past tense verb, even for those current activities. So yeah, you don't necessarily need those periods.
Yeah, your grammar is already wrong technically for English when you're not starting with an I or a we or whatever it is. So yeah, we recommend the no periods for sure. That's a great question. Okay, well, in that spirit, we did have a few miscellaneous reminders that we wanted to put on here and things that just didn't come up throughout. So a few things. One thing that's really important is the order in which you're listing your experiences, and the correct order to be doing it would be what we call reverse chronological order. So the most recent thing would be the first thing in your section, and then you go backwards in time from there. I see that flip-flopped on students' resumes quite a bit, where they'll put their oldest one in there, so they're going in regular chronological order. It is reverse chronological. We want to see what you're doing most recently, and then you go backwards in time. Do note, this is in each section. So this isn't for the entirety of the resume. So if you have a volunteer experience section, you'll have your volunteer experiences in that order. And then when you start a new section, work experience, you'll have your work experience section or experiences in reverse chronological order. So just something to watch for. We definitely check on that when we review resumes, is to make sure that your experiences are in the correct order by date. Like we just said, no period on your bullet points. We already talked about that. This third one is my nitpicky little thing. When you list out your GPA, I like it when the decimal points match. I don't know if that's just me being anal or what, but I like to see if you're going to put 2 decimal points with your first GPA, match those decimal points with the 4.00 scale that you're going to use. And then Savik mentioned this earlier, but just to reiterate on that skills section, that should be things for, or that should be used for hard skills, right? So some examples of hard skills would be like computer programs that you know how to use, your foreign language proficiency, certifications maybe that you've had, that kind of thing would be in a skills section. Your teamwork, your communication, that kind of stuff is, like Savik mentioned before, not going to go in there. We're going to talk about in those bullet points that we were just looking at on the previous slides. One note on the foreign language, bringing up Savik's friend's example. I've never watched the show, but I get the point. When you are listing things out in a skills section, if you are going to list computer programs or, you know, programming languages that you know how to use, foreign languages, it's nice to put your proficiency level with it. So, you know, if you took 4 years of Spanish in high school, that does not make most of us fluent. Lucky you if it did, that would be great. But you might want to put in parentheses next to it basic or intermediate to say what proficiency level you are, so that there's an expectation about kind of what you're coming in with, and there's not an expectation that you're a native speaker. Anything else on this Savik that you can think of?
You know, I know we just kind of crammed in resumes into like 20 minutes, and there's a lot to take in. I mean, there's no doubt about that, but that's where Courtney and I come into play. Our job is to make this process as easy as possible. So, you know, we'll talk about how to get a hold of us here at the back end of the presentation, but don't feel like you have to master all of this tonight. This is something that I still like look back at my resume, even as a career advisor, and I'm like, ooh, yeah, I forgot to do this, or I put a comma here that doesn't need to be there, or whatever. So just know that it's okay to talk to us about your rough drafts, and we can take that rough draft and make it exactly what we need to. So again, we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but with the remaining time that we do have, let's talk about interviewing. Before we get into that, let's use the chat here. So put this number into the chat, a scale of 1 to 5. 5 meaning like I am a stellar interviewer, I am ready to roll. And then a 1 is like, I don't really like interviewing. I like just kind of hanging out and not talking to anyone. So just throw the number in there, and it's a judgment-free zone. You know, if you asked me this question when I was an undergrad, probably the number that I would have thrown in here would have been like -1. So it's okay to kind of be, you know, anywhere on that scale. And I think what Courtney and I will try to hopefully do is share with you some tips, tricks, and resources that can take these 2s, these 3s, these 4s to that next level. It's just about getting that much better with interviews. So let's jump in.
Me? You want me to do this one?
Sure.
Okay, here I go. Okay, no, I'm good. Okay, so we wanted to talk to you guys about some different questions to be thinking about. I don't know if you all have interviewed before. I have done this a million times where I'll Google common interview questions, right? And there's some that come up quite frequently on your Google searches. And I can say from going, I mean, I'm not that old, but I've interviewed a few times by now, right? And there's some common questions that do come up quite a bit that you can probably be prepared for. as you go into grad school or job interviews. They're just common, people like to hear the answers to these ones. So some of these are on the slide here. Tell us about yourself or tell me about yourself, for sure going to get that question. So that's definitely one to be thinking through. Sounds kind of easy, but honestly, that one's that'll trip you up a little bit when you are on the spot and you're like, am I supposed to say where I was born, my siblings' names? Like, how much do I give here? So there is some prep work that goes into that question. So good to think about. FYI, you should focus on your professional self in that question. Other common questions, greatest strengths and weaknesses. You guys might have heard of that one before. How would blank describe you? So a former colleague, a supervisor, your friends. That is a common one to get asked. How would someone else describe you? Why are you interested in this job or this program or this field? Very common to get asked that one too. Sometimes that one will be connected to the tell me about yourself one. So they'll really trip you up at the start. They'll say, tell me about yourself and why you're interested in this position. And you're like, here we go. Got to jump right in. And then the last one here, where do you see yourself in so many years? 5 years, pretty common, different things like that. We'll talk about answers a little bit. Honestly, there's not necessarily, I haven't cracked the code. I don't think Savik has cracked the code about what the perfect response is. It's just being prepared to answer it in your own way, right? If someone asks you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? You want to be prepared to talk about that, obviously in an interview setting in a professional light. Same thing with how would a colleague describe you? You probably don't want to say like party animal, you want to say something a little bit more relevant to the profession or the program that you're going into. As you think through these, you'll come up with stuff that you want to say about yourself. You know what I mean? One of the best things that I ever did, have you guys taken Strengths Finder? Are you familiar with like Clifton Strengths and things like that? I cheat every interview and I'll bring out those Clifton Strengths because there are 5 great words that describe me. So when someone asks me, how does my supervisor describe me? I can use that. When someone asks me what's my greatest strength, I'm really locked and loaded. And I can use that for my weakness too, to kind of do the flip side of my strength. So there's just some ways to prep for these. But we'll talk a little bit about how to answer them as we go too.
Yeah, and as Courtney mentioned, like you can predict some of the basic interview questions, but we could also 100% also predict what kinds of questions they'll ask you for like numbers 7 through 14. And that's probably going to be something along these lines. And so, especially if you're thinking about applying for graduate school, my recommendation would be to create an Excel document or Google Sheets or however you want to stay organized. And basically on the first column would be a list of all the schools that you may be interested in. And then on the following columns, you can then think about answering some of these kinds of questions. And I think what you'll really find very quickly is that different schools like to talk about different things. So I'll give you an example. If you're thinking about, hey, maybe someday I would love to go to the Carver College of Medicine. If you go on their website, they talk a lot about research. And so you might have the ability to predict that they may ask you some sort of research-based question. On the flip side, let's say you're looking at Creighton for med school. Something that they have a lot about on their website is community service and giving back, volunteering. So then you could probably make an assumption that they may ask you a question about that because that's kind of what they stick their flag on. So doing that research into these different kinds of programs will really, really help you think about answering some of these questions that are on here as well. The other tip that I have when you think about applying for graduate school is to look at the faculty that are going to be teaching in your graduate program. Because more times than not, you might come across that graduate faculty member in one of your interviews. I know, especially when I applied for grad school, one of my faculty members was on the panel, and I had that inside knowledge because I was able to look and see what kind of work she had done in the past and kind of where her interests lie. So I knew that I could probably kind of tailor my information, tailor my answers to that person and to that individual. And so again, that's kind of, if you do more of that legwork and kind of do that research based off of those programs, based off of the companies you're applying for, it can really help answer some of these questions. And again, we'll talk about how to give an effective answer here in a couple slides. But again, just be thinking about what kinds of questions they may ask you from the slide before and this current slide too.
Okay, so a big piece of advice. What's the point of an interview, right? Why are they doing this? Why do I have to go through this? You want to think about the deeper question that they're really asking you and what are they trying to look for? What are they digging for in that question that they're asking you? So like, for example, tell us about a time when you had a conflict with a coworker and what you did in that situation, right? I can tell you for sure, they don't care about the actual conflict, right? The conflict that you give, the story that you give sets the scene, but what they're really looking for is your response to the, what did you do in that situation? And of course, they're looking for a positive response. So the bigger picture behind this question is, how does this person deal with conflict in the workplace, right? They want to figure out, were they proactive? Did they have a conversation? Did they go tattle? You know, because if that's how you tell your story, then that's what they know about you in terms of how you'll behave when that comes up in their medical school program or in that job. You know what I mean? So you're always wanting to evaluate, what are they really asking? Because it's always the last part of it that they're really looking for. You're just setting the scene with that story. So when you're getting that, tell me about a time, or give me an example of, all of that example or that story is the front end, set the scene, but remember to answer the back end of what they're actually asking for. Does that make sense? It's not rocket science, but sometimes students get really worked up in, oh, I got to come up with a great story or a great example, and they forget to get to the highlight of it, which is how they, you know, responded in a situation, or how they handle stress, or whatever the question's asking. So I thought it was important to throw a reminder in about that as we think about these questions.
Yeah, so we have an easy way to kind of remember that pathway, and that's simply the STAR method. So the STAR method stands for situation, task, action, result. So if you were to get that question about, you know, whatever the case may be, this is a nice and easy way to do this. So I'll give you an example. When I was interviewing for the job that I have right now, however long that was ago, Courtney actually asked me the question, okay, Savik, you're applying to be an assessment manager. Can you talk to me about a time when you had to use your assessment skills to make improvements on a program? The first thing that I did was like give Courtney like the death stare. I'm like, are you kidding me? I thought we were friends. But having said that,
at the time.
Yeah. So then I was like, all right, let me set the situation. Let me set the scene. The scene that I brought up was talking about diversity programming that I used to run in my previous role. So I gave a quick snippet about the situation, the scene, the event that we were hosting, and my role in that event. The task, what did I actually have to do? I then talked about giving out surveys to our event attendees to track to see, you know, were they getting what they were needing out of the event? Were they learning about things about the University of Iowa? What did I actually do? I talked about then going through all the survey responses, coding all that information, and then the result was making changes to the program based off of the action that I took place. And really, if you kind of think about it, again, it's exactly what Courtney mentioned. A bulk of my answer to that question were spent in the action and were spent in the result, because ultimately that's what they're looking for. They want to know, what was your role in that situation? How did you learn from it? What did you bring back? And then how did you make changes or improvements for that next step? And it's the same kind of deal. The position that I applied for, it literally said on the job description, we need someone to assess data. And I'm like, okay, they're probably going to ask me then a data related question. So doing some of that research on the job description, doing some of that research into the office really helped me figure out what kind of situation I was going to bring up, and then what that result was too. So it sounds, as you know, it sounds really simple, but if you can kind of keep this in the back of your mind, STAR, set the scene. What did you do? What did you have to do? What did you actually do? What was the result of the outcome? The STAR method is a super simple way to deliver some really effective and confident interview answers.
Absolutely. Okay, so those behavioral questions that we talked about, tell me about a time when, give me an example when, those ones are scary. I mean, to this day, you don't know what they're going to ask, and you're like, shoot, I'm going to get stuck. I'm not going to be able to come up with a story. So I have found this has worked really well for me. So I wanted to share it with you all. My recommendation is to come up with like your 5 bubbles, right? So that's why I kind of drew this person with 5 bubbles over them. So instead of getting a question and pulling from every memory that you've had in your 21 years, pull from your 5 bubbles, right? So I gave some examples on here. An example student would be, one of their bubbles would be academics. So they will have reflected on their academic history. Okay, I had to do that group project one time. Oh, it was kind of a pain. That one girl, she didn't pull her weight, so I had to take a leadership role. Okay, I got that. I'm ready if they ask me about a time where I had a conflict or a time where I had to step up. Boom. Okay, I have my research in my bio lab. Let me reflect on that. I wrote something with my my lead researcher. I had that issue with the fruit flies. I'm making things up, obviously, but you're getting my point that you want to reflect on each of those areas, really think back on all the tasks that you did in each of those bubbles. Because when you think about those stories, it's going to be way easier to pull them out from your bubbles than the abyss of memories that you've ever had, if that makes sense. And of course, you can strategize about what your bubbles are, right? So for me, when I applied for my current job, career advisor, one of my bubbles was I was a career advisor before at the University of Nebraska. That's probably relevant. Okay, that's a bubble. Let me think about that. I was an academic advisor. Okay, how did I help students in that capacity, and what could I bring in? Okay, let me think about that. Oh, I had this great program in grad school. That's one of my bubbles. So it's just thinking through and really reflecting on those different areas, thinking about even the little snippets or one-off experiences that you had with a group project, or a homework assignment that was really challenging. So you went and asked for help. So now you can answer a question about what did you do during a challenging situation? You know what I mean? It just preps you to be able to pull those stories out a little bit easier. And I think 5 is probably a good amount. Most of you will probably be able to come up with your 5 bubbles. And you'll be able to answer a lot of questions with it and not be so caught off guard when you do get those behavioral questions. Savik, do you have anything to add on that?
I love this, especially when you think about like actually being in an interview. Most of the time, I always advise students, especially if you're in person, to have like a Padfolio near you and having your little circles right there on your Padfolio. So when you have it like open, you're kind of looking at it and you know that that's a resource. And if it's virtual, it's even better because they don't really know what's kind of in front of you. All they see is your face on this little box, right? And so
put that sticky note right by your webcam.
Totally. Yeah. And like most of the time when I do these presentations, I've got a little like smiley face right here because I like look off into the distance because that's kind of how my brain works. So I'm like, okay, zone in right here. But you all don't know that. Well, now you do because I told you, but it's a nice little tip that you can all incorporate is have some of those notes in front of you, whether it's in person in those Padfolios or all across your desk on these webcams. There is a tool that I'm going to put this link into our little chat window, and that's going to be Big Interview. So as you think about like, how do you practice some of these things out? Big Interview is an awesome resource to utilize. Basically, what it's going to allow you to do is to practice your interview skills, get sample questions, and that you could set the module to either be for employment or for graduate school. So it's a great way to kind of hear and practice some of those questions out before you actually have to go do it in person. One of my favorite features about Big Interview is that you can record yourself giving those interview answers. So that way you can then, watch it for yourself, or you can share that with a career advisor. So myself or Courtney or any one of us, and we can provide you some tips that you can incorporate to certain questions. I know when I first started working in the Career Center, they're like, okay, Savik, go learn all these resources, go use them. And so Big Interview was a little bit eye-opening for me because one thing that I noticed, and some of you may have noticed this tonight, I'm a hand talker. So watching my video back, I was like, okay, if I'm in that interview setting, I need to like sit on one of my hands and keep the other hand on like my pen or whatever, because I don't want this to be, distracting, because I want you to be listening and kind of following what I'm saying. And so I love Big Interview. I would highly recommend to take advantage of this and take advantage of that resource. But the other thing that you can also do, and we did this a little bit earlier on this week, I had an appointment with a student and she was interviewing for an internship. And we basically kind of ran through the interviews as well. And so I had a list of sample questions that she wanted me to ask, and I asked them, and we basically did a mock interview right here through these webcams. And so just know that, again, it's the same deal as the resume. Don't feel like you have to know all of the answers that we presented to you tonight. Schedule these advising appointments, use the resources that are around you. A lot of really great things that'll help you, again, take you from that 2, 3, 4 to those 5s and then beyond that as well. So that I think was that our last slide, Courtney? I don't remember.
Yes.
Oh, we're here to help. There it is.
We are. Yes. So obviously things are weird, COVID, as we all know. Our office is minimally staffed. We have about 3 people there at a time, but we're offering everything virtually. So we're still doing all of our appointments. Our career peer advisors are doing virtual appointments as well, and they are great to help with resume development and things like that. So FYI, check out our website. I assume we're going to hold steady on our virtual front for the rest of the spring, but who knows what's going to happen for the fall. We're all up in the air on that, but just wanted to throw that out there that we're here to help. There's 5 of us that are health and wellness advisors total, Savik and I being 2 of them. So happy to help. And Iowa. So we wanted to provide some time for questions. I'm going to stop my share so that I can see some of you that are on camera and we can answer as we need. Does anyone have anything for us?
And there's like a 0% chance that we got through everything. So like, I know there's questions out there, so don't be shy.
I have a question.
Yes.
I've heard that when in an interview, if someone asks you a question, it's okay to like take a moment and like think about it. But how much time is too much time? When does it become just plain old awkward to just have someone stare you down and under that pressure, your mind just blanks? What is that?
Yeah, I love this question because this happens to me all the time. Some of you may have noticed this already, but like my mouth starts talking before like my brain starts processing. So one of my favorite things to do when I'm in those interview situations is to have your bottle of water right next to you. And if you start to kind of get those like butterflies in your stomachs because you start to hear those questions and you're like, I have no idea how to answer this. Before the interviewer finishes their question, I'll take a sip of my water and not obviously chug your water, but just take a nice little sip. And that way kind of gives yourself a mental break to refocus and then come up with that answer. I would say that, in terms of timing wise, I would just say it's just a regular conversation speed. So like if you give yourself like 5-7 seconds, I think that's okay. And interviewers also understand that. I think Courtney and I've interviewed many people before, and we understand that it's a nerve-wracking process. And ultimately, what we want out of our applicants is for them to be able to put their best foot forward, because we're not going to know if we're making the right hiring decision unless we give you that space to really come up with those solid examples. So I think that's absolutely fine. But if you want that tip, I love having that water bottle right next to me to buy me that extra 30 seconds or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I'll say too, like, don't be weird. You know what I mean? Like there's a difference between sitting there and like catching your breath or something and being like 1, 2, 3,
Yeah.
4. You know what I mean? Like counting down. Like that would be a little bit awkward. Of course, you want to come off as a normal human being in your interview too. But I think it's okay. Sometimes repeating the question is a little bit helpful too. Oh, let me think of a question. My strengths and weaknesses. That's a good one. Yeah. So I would say that taught me like 3 seconds. You know what I mean? By repeating what they kind of said and asking it again or saying it. So what's normal. You know how to have a regular conversation. So take your time, and they get it too, especially on those ones that are meant to kind of stump you. They know
Totally.
that you need a second.
I have a question in terms of just the formatting of interviews for like the summer. This summer, I'm applying, and interview cycles like coming up here in like June, July, August, really up for like rest of 2021. Do you think that's going to be mostly virtual then, for most of the like med school interviews then?
Yeah,
I would say for sure.
Yeah. The one thing that I've completely spaced on mentioning on that big interview slide is, if any of you need a space to do your med school interviews or do any interview for that matter, where you're like, I can trust the lighting, I can trust the Wi-Fi, I can trust that it's a quiet place. We have a number of interview suites that you can reserve, and all you have to do is just call our main office and say, hey, I've got an interview on Thursday from X hour to this time or whatever. And you can reserve yourself that quiet space. And so just know that that's a resource that you have available if you have those virtual interviews coming up this semester or even over the summer too.
Yeah, I can't guarantee that it's going to be virtual, but I would be kind of floored if it wasn't just a little while longer, I would think. I don't know. That's a good question though. What else?
How do we schedule one-on-one meetings? Yeah, great question. So the easiest way to do this is to just jump into your MyUI, go into MyUI, advising appointments. In the dropdown, you can then select the Pomerantz Career Center, and then you could select health and wellness if you want to talk about health and wellness careers. And then you'll see the available office hours that are going to be on there. The other option is to call our office at 319-335-1023.
He knows the number by heart. Look at that. That's good of you.
But anyways, it'll get you connected to one of my favorite people in the entire University of Iowa campus, Regina. And Regina can get you scheduled as well. So either or works completely fine. I really kind of like using MyUI because you can select like what kind of appointment you want to talk about, and you'll see all the options that are on there. Cover letters. We did not talk about cover letters tonight. I believe Lynn sent out a video about writing personal statements for med school. If any of you watched that, you probably saw my face again. So you're probably sick of hearing me. But for cover letters, we did not get a chance to talk about it tonight. I'm going to drop a chat in here though about cover letters, so you can use that as a guide. But again, it's the same deal. Take a look at the information that's on there. And if you've got more questions beyond that, just connect with either one of us and we're happy to help you.
Mhm.
Here is the cover letter link.
Would you guys be able to give a quick description about the difference between a CV and a resume? Because I've seen that in a few different places, and I have a resume, but I've never had to make a CV, and I figure there are some similarities, but I don't really know what exactly the difference is.
Yeah, so I call a CV an academic resume, at least for college students, because like if you look at a faculty member's CV, it's like, 50 pages long with all of their presentations and all their publications and things like that on there. Most of us don't have 50 pages worth of presentations and publications fresh out of college. So that's why I call it the academic resume. Pretty much a CV has all those same sections that was on that particular slide where it said, publications, professional affiliations, that kind of thing is what really makes a CV. I think there's really not that big of a difference except expanding on those categories a little bit more, which we have found that most college students don't have a super abundance of that fresh out, if that makes sense. So not really a difference. A CV can be super long, like I said. And for you guys, I'm thinking 2 pages tops is probably what you're going to be going to med school with in terms of, or grad school of some sort, in terms of the length on your document.
Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, and there's a link in the chat again. Just want to make sure you all are aware for CVs. You'll be able to see the list of section headers, and they're again very on that. I like how Courtney phrases it, an academic resume. So check that out. And again, schedule a follow-up appointment. Happy to help.
I had a quick question about thank you letters. I know you're supposed to send thank you letters after the initial interview, but if you have like a secondary interview, are you also supposed to send another one, or does the first one kind of account for it?
Were you gonna go?
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say I do them after every round, especially if you meet different people. And the one thing that I always like to do, even if I was just doing one like first round thank you letter, is to try to be really specific with what you're thanking them for. So if you are in those meetings and you say something that really connects with another individual, so maybe you talk about a student org, we'll just use the Indian Student Alliance because that was what I was a part of. So if I talked about ISA, for example, and someone else was like really connecting with that, then it's a great way to write in that thank you card specifically to that individual to say, hey, I love chatting about this. Would love to, make them tailored that way. It's a little bit different if you do multiple rounds of thank you cards to the same people.
Mm-hmm. I would also say thank you emails are really appropriate, especially given the times. And I think like Savik's saying, if you make it like specific, right? So you're going to say something in it that distinguishes it from your first interview, even if it's the same person, you might say, so great chatting with you again for the second time. I was happy to learn about these new things that we brought up or whatever, something more eloquently stated than that. But yeah, I think if you just highlight that this is a different thank you, but you're still grateful for the opportunity or whatever, I think that's totally fair to do. Mm-hmm. And it's nice. It keeps your name on their radar, like she's polite. That's a positive quality. Anything else?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So earlier, Savik, you pulled out a notebook. I was just wondering how we're supposed to use that notebook. What are we supposed to write down? And we have to write down anything prior to the interview or what we should write down during the interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I, my actual Padfolio, I had it out earlier. I was using it as an example, but really what I like to do with these notebooks is I like to write down like those things that you want to for sure bring up in your interview. So those experiences. So in that, if you can remember back to that slide that had like a stick figure and the 5 circles of different experiences, that's what I had written down at the very, very top. These are the things that I for sure want to bring up in my interview. And the way that you know that is by doing a little bit of research into either the school that you're applying for or the company you're applying for. So try to think about those relevant experiences so that way you don't have to forget about them on the spot. The other thing that I like to do with my notebook or my notes is I like to write down like keywords to questions that usually stump me. So for whatever reason, if you were to sit there right now and you ask me, Savik, what are your top strengths and what are some weaknesses? I just, for whatever reason, I just can't eloquently say and answer those. So knowing that I struggle with that question, I write down my answer to that question in my notebook. So that way, when I'm, drinking my water, I can look down and say, okay, here's my 4 strengths I'm going to bring up, and here's a weakness that I'm going to bring up. So I just like to put down stuff to help me stay focused and kind of remember to bring these things up. And then on like the second page or right beneath it, that's where I take my specific thank you card notes. So if someone says something that I'm like, ooh, that really connects with me, I write that down. And then the final part of my Padfolio or notebook is things that I like and things that I don't like about the organization or the school. I mean, if you are fortunate enough to have those in-person interviews and you're walking around, let's say, our campus, and you're like, oh man, Murph is green and I don't like green, then you can write that down as like a con. That was a really bad example, but first thing I could think of. But that's kind of like what I like to use my Padfolio for, is things to keep me on task, things that can really help me get out of a pickle, and then my pros and cons list along with those specific thank you notes.
I'll add to that. One thing that I always write down is the questions that I want to ask them at the end, because they will always say to you, do you have any questions for us? And you're flustered at this point, right? You just went through an interview, you're like sweaty, like you're just not ready. Nothing comes to mind. So I always write down some quality questions that I want to have. And I'll straight up say, you know what? I took the liberty of writing these down beforehand. Do you mind if I ask? And then I'll look right down, read my question out, and then pressure's off me to like come up with that on the spot. So I always have those locked and loaded in my Padfolio for sure.
Is it wrong to not have questions ready to go? Like if they ask you, do you have any questions for me? And you go, nah, I think I'm good, in a more nice and polite way during an interview. But basically is that like a red flag typically?
I don't know about red flag, but to me, it's like, try to have at least one.
Yeah.
And you can really ask. What I have found, especially when you talk to, a professional versus like an HR recruiter or whatever, people really love talking about themselves and they love talking about their personal experiences. So something that I love asking, kind of one of my default questions is, how did you get to where you are? What are some steps that you took along your career path? So that we kind of break the ice a little bit. Then I like to ask questions about the organization or the college, something specific about that. So, I mean, I think really when you think about those questions, try to come up with at least one. I like to have at least 3 in the bag ready to go.
Mm-hmm. I think Savik is hitting the nail on the head. Asking someone else about them is going to get them talking for at least a little bit so you can come up with something else. You know what I mean? What do you like most about working here? Great. Here they go. They're off to the races for a minute and a half talking about that. So I 100% agree.
Brooklyn, I think you were unmuting yourself too. Do you have a question?
Oh, I was going to ask, like, what type of questions should we ask? But then you answered it.
Perfect. Read your mind.
Anticipated.
You all might be.
Oh, sorry, Savik, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you all might be thinking that it's about time to go to dinner. And so if you do have questions moving forward, there's my email address. So let us know. We're happy to help. This doesn't have to be a one and done type of situation. So that's it. I'm done.
Mine in here as well.
Sorry.
I wanted to throw in one final thing as a plug. I don't know if any of you guys care about this, but we are hiring for peer advisors in our office. And I know you're all high quality students. And so I just want to throw it out. If anyone's looking for a next year internship, I'm your supervisor and I think I'm super hip and fun and cool. And so Savik, gotta lie. I just want to throw out, if you guys know anyone or you personally want to apply, help a sister out, would love to have some quality candidates for my position, and you get to work with wonderful people in the Career Center. So win-win.
Well, Courtney, if you just email either me or Tina K some more information about that, we can also advertise that to our members who weren't able to make it as well, just so we can get that out there.
Yep, so just saw Julie's question come in, so I'll shoot you an email afterward.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you both so much for hosting this for us. We're going to post this video to our MAP site